Hey everyone, tonight we're looking up, but not with wonder, not with that quiet awe you get when you see the stars on a clear night, far from the noise of cities. No, tonight we're looking up, with hesitation, because something is wrong. The stars are still there, the constellations haven't disappeared, but they've started to feel different, as if they're not quite in the same place they used to be, as if they're not shining, but watching. This isn't a story about comets or solar storms. It's not a tale of distant galaxies or theories of the Big Bang. It's something quieter, slower, something that started with one astronomer noticing a shift in Polaris, then another realizing Orion's belt was off by a fraction of a degree, and then, one by one, observatories around the world went dark. Not from power outages, from silence, from doubt. But before we get too far into the unsettling part, take a moment to settle in. Dim the lights. Get under the blanket. Maybe open the window just a little, if the night's kind. Let the fan hum, or the heater click, or the city outside lull you with its soft mechanical breathing. Wherever you are, however you're listening, I'm glad you're here. Let me know where you're tuning in from. It's always strange and beautiful to see just how far these stories drift. Now, breathe easy. Let your eyes close if they want. Because tonight, we're going on a journey, not far, not fast, but deep, into the space just behind the sky, the one we thought we understood, until it started looking back. It started slowly, the kind of change you don't notice until you're already too far into it to go back. The stars, for a time, simply became less reliable. Not gone, not dimmed, just unsettled. The earliest reports came from deep sky observatories, not amateur stargazers or backyard hobbyists, but professional facilities equipped with atomic clocks and layered optics, the kind that measure the subtle pulse of a pulsar with a margin of error thinner than a breath. And yet, they began to whisper the same doubt. The sky was wrong, not broken, just misaligned. Polaris, the North Star, had shifted by a microdegree. At first, it was explained away as atmospheric interference, then as tectonic drift, then as a calibration bug. But as the days stretched into weeks, the shifts grew more erratic, not in size, but in pattern. The stars weren't drifting randomly. They were realigning, slowly, patiently, with purpose. Kellen Hayes was among the first to notice the pattern, though he never claimed credit. He was a systems analyst for an orbital weather array, a job that mostly involved monitoring low-orbit interference and solar wind fluctuations. But he'd always had a quiet love for star maps, the old kind, analog, printed, yellowed with time. On his off hours, he would cross-reference them with the current sky, not because he distrusted the digital systems, but because he liked the way they felt, permanent, until they weren't. One evening, looking out from the observatory deck with a paper chart in hand, Kellen saw it. Orion's belt was too low. Not by much, just enough to itch in the back of his mind, enough to keep him from sleeping. He rechecked the scans, ran overlays, and confirmed it. Then confirmed it again 3 days later, when the shift had grown by another fraction. He reported it to his supervisor, who politely reminded him that atmospheric refraction could bend light in strange ways, especially during solar minimum. But Kellen had already ruled that out. The pattern wasn't random. It was recursive, self-correcting, like something was moving the stars back into place, but not the original place, a new one no one had agreed on. He shared his findings in a low-level scientific forum. They were ignored, then reposted by someone else, and ignored again. until someone noticed that the Southern Cross had vanished for 2 full nights over the Indian Ocean. Not obscured, not cloudy, gone. Telescopes were turned, satellites activated, and quietly, without press or announcement, governments began to issue strange silence protocols to their astronomical divisions. Civilians were told nothing, not yet. Because how do you explain that the sky has started to lie, or worse, that it was never truthful to begin with? Theories flooded the private networks. Some blamed gravitational lensing from a dark matter bloom. Others suspected quantum irregularities from a failed deep space experiment. A few whispered about simulation collapse, as if the code behind the universe had begun to rewrite itself. But Kellen noticed something they hadn't. He wasn't looking at the light. He was looking at the rhythm. The shifts occurred not at random, but at intervals, small ones, hidden in noise, but consistent, like a ticking clock buried under layers of wind. When he plotted the changes over time, he found the intervals weren't shortening or lengthening. They were converging, as if something behind the stars was tightening its grip, pulling the night sky into focus. Not our focus, its. The breakthrough came during what should have been a routine skywalk. Kellen had volunteered for maintenance duty aboard the upper deck of the observation ring, a task that required full tether and suit protocol. Out there, with only the earth below and the stars above, he felt peace, until he looked up, not at a screen, not through a scope, but with his own eyes. And he saw it. The stars weren't twinkling, not any of them, not even the lower magnitude ones. There was no atmospheric distortion to blame, no interference, just steady, unwavering points, as if they were painted on. And in the center, where Vega should have been, there was a blank space, a patch of sky without stars, circular, clean, not dark, not bright, just absent. He stared, counted, blinked. It didn't go away. When he reported it, the system showed nothing unusual. The telemetry returned clean. The camera logs didn't show the absence. But Kellen had seen it, and later, when he replayed his own helmet cam, the moment was simply gone. Skipped, like time had jumped, like reality had been corrected. But not for him. That night, alone in his quarters, he searched again. Star maps, long-range data, archived sky patterns from 50 years prior. And there it was, a faint, repeating anomaly at the same coordinates, always dismissed as dust, as static, as nothing, but always the same shape, always the same size, as if the sky had been hiding something all along, something that was now beginning to move. Kellen didn't sleep after that night, not out of fear, not yet, but because the question had taken root. A slow, steady whisper that something fundamental had changed, and no one else seemed willing to say it out loud. He kept returning to the same coordinates, running simulations, layering old satellite footage over modern orbital patterns. It wasn't just that a patch of stars had vanished, it was that everything around it had subtly bent to accommodate the absence. Constellations had shifted their orientation. Background light intensity had changed. Gravitational readings, though still technically within tolerance, began to diverge from predicted models. It was as if space itself had flexed, just slightly, to make room for something unaccounted for. He thought, at first, of gravitational lensing, how massive bodies like black holes could warp the appearance of objects behind them. But this wasn't a distortion. It wasn't a smearing or bending of light. It was a blankness, a perfect, starless void that remained static regardless of observational vector. You could move the telescope, change the angle, shift the instruments. The shape would remain, unyielding, silent, He started calling it the blind spot, quietly, just in his notes, not out of superstition, but because it felt wrong to name something that didn't seem to want to be named. Then came the dreams, subtle at first, glimpses, standing alone on the upper platform, staring into that patch of sky as it pulsed, not with light, but with memory. Images that didn't belong to him. A vast plain under 3 moons, a city folded into itself like origami, a ceiling that looked like the night sky but shifted when you blinked. None of it made sense, but he woke up from each one feeling watched, not haunted, just noticed. And then others started having them too. One of the night shift engineers, a woman named Sira, mentioned in passing that she'd been dreaming of walking backward through snow that left no footprints. Another described a hallway where all the doors led to the same room, a dark dome with a moving ceiling. Kellen didn't tell them what he was seeing, not at first, but he began taking notes, tracking the dates, the times, the phases of the sky, and there it was again. Rhythm. All the dreams clustered around the same intervals as the star drift, the same pattern, the same quiet regularity, like tides no one remembered naming. He tried bringing it up through official channels, gently, cautiously, but the responses were polite walls. Focus on your core responsibilities. Your metrics have been excellent this quarter, but we're not resourced for speculative research. Maybe step away from night shifts for a while. That last one was telling. It meant they knew, or suspected, or at least didn't want anyone digging deeper. So Kellen began storing everything offline. He printed images, made paper maps, dug up old analog records from before the sky was automated, and he began to see it. The slow erosion of celestial consensus. What had once been immutable had begun to shift. Not quickly, not loudly, but absolutely. The stars, once the definition of constancy, were now revealing themselves as something far more fragile, or perhaps just more reactive. He wondered, not for the first time, if they'd ever truly been fixed at all, or if we'd just convinced ourselves they were. The idea burrowed into him, that what we call sky might not be a window at all, but a kind of projection, a surface, a skin, and something, somewhere behind it, had finally decided to move. The next anomaly came from a deep scan relay positioned at one of the Lagrange points. It wasn't even looking for visual data. Its job was to monitor electromagnetic background radiation, solar winds, and stray interference. But it caught something, a burst, not a flare or a spike, a response. A low-frequency pulse that perfectly mirrored a test signal sent from Earth 6 years prior. A ping meant to calibrate deep space comms, one that was never expected to return, but it had. Not from where it was sent, not through any known reflective medium. It had come from the blind spot. Kellen accessed the logs by accident, or at least that's what he told himself. They weren't classified, just archived and ignored, buried under test telemetry and routine maintenance reports. But once he saw it, he couldn't unsee it. The timing, the precision, the quiet mimicry. It wasn't just a reply. It was a demonstration. Something had heard the signal, understood it, and chosen to send it back, slowly, subtly, without announcement. And then, over the course of 3 nights, the blind spot grew, not dramatically, but measurably, by the width of a thumbnail held at arm's length. The stars bordering its edge appeared to retreat, as if making way. The observatory's automated sensors flagged no issue. The images remained unchanged in the archives, but Kellen could see it with his own eyes. Each night, a little more of the sky was missing. He tried to record it through his helmet cam. The footage showed nothing, just stars, just normal. But the timestamps were wrong. Each one contained a gap of exactly 12 minutes and 43 seconds, missing time, edited, but not by him, not by anyone. He finally spoke to Sarah, shared everything, the maps, the intervals, the gaps in footage. She didn't laugh, she didn't argue. She just nodded and said, "I thought I was the only one." That's when he knew. Whatever was happening wasn't new. It had only just begun to notice that we were noticing. The human mind is built for patterns. We find shapes in clouds, rhythms in wind, meaning in silence. It's what allowed us to survive, to organize stars into constellations and constellations into myths. But sometimes, when the pattern stares back, we don't know what to do with it. Kellen and Sarah began meeting in the maintenance corridors during low traffic hours, exchanging fragments of sky maps, old recordings, instinctive sketches made from memory. She showed him a journal she'd been keeping, written by hand. A practice long abandoned, now oddly comforting. Inside were entries not just of dreams, but of a creeping sense that the night sky was beginning to press inward, like the dome of a planetarium that had started to descend. She spoke of subtle changes, shadows where none should be, stars that blinked off rather than dimmed, a moment during a solo shift when she turned to glance at the ceiling and found herself staring directly into a sky that hadn't been projected there. "I looked up," she whispered once, "and it was already looking down." Kellen said nothing. He didn't have to. He'd seen the same. They began to cross-reference historical anomalies, quiet ones, things that hadn't made headlines. An early 21st century report from a lunar outpost where astronauts complained of misplaced constellations, a declassified transmission from a deep space probe whose final log described stars behaving as if choreographed, and the most unsettling, a decades-old personal recording from an astrophysicist who had disappeared in orbit. Her last words, "The stars are trying too hard." They brought this data to a system supervisor they trusted, or thought they did. His reaction wasn't skepticism, it was silence. Not the kind of silence born from disbelief, the kind that comes from recognition. "You shouldn't be looking at those files," he said. "Not because they're classified, because they don't belong to us." That night, Kellen's access was revoked. Not officially, not in the system. But his credentials began to fail randomly. Data sets he'd had for years vanished from the servers. Logs corrupted. Sarah's journal was stolen from her quarters, though nothing else was touched. The two of them stopped meeting in public. The observatory, once a place of slow-moving science and half-slept shifts, had turned cold. Paranoid, as if it too had been told to stop noticing. The blind spot, meanwhile, continued to expand. Not consistently, not visibly, but they could feel it. The stars on its border no longer twinkled, not from light pollution or lens failure, but because twinkling is an atmospheric effect. And these stars were no longer shining through anything. They were flat, hollow, performative, like decals on glass. Then came the birds. Migratory paths began to drift. Species that had once navigated by stars were now flying in strange formations, landing in the wrong hemispheres. Animal biologists blamed climate change. But Sarah noted something else. She'd found wildlife tracker logs with magnetic orientation errors, as if the field had twisted, not globally, but directionally, toward the blind spot. It was as if something massive, something unknown, was exerting a kind of non-gravitational influence on the entire biosphere. Subtle, cumulative, real, Then came the first disappearance. An unmanned relay drone, orbiting the blind spot perimeter, lost contact. Nothing unusual, until the maintenance team retrieved its last positional data and found had accelerated toward the void. No course correction, no known propulsion. It had simply begun to fall, upward. The report listed it as orbital decay anomaly, but Kellen traced the telemetry manually. The drone's velocity hadn't matched any known orbital model. Its motion had matched intention, as if it had been invited, pulled not by force, but by alignment, a kind of resonance. The blind spot pulsed the next night. Kellen didn't see it with instruments. He felt it. In the moment, his thoughts paused, his breath caught, and time slid sideways. For 11 seconds, the ship's clocks froze. Heart monitors flatlined. Artificial gravity faltered. And then everything resumed. Not one system registered the gap. Not one log recorded the break. But people knew. Every crew member in orbit woke at the same instant, wide-eyed and confused, remembering only fragments. Old faces, forgotten words, places that never existed. Sarah described it best. It was like dreaming someone else's life in a room I've never left. Kellen checked the blind spot coordinates again. They had shifted, not outward, not expanding, inward, closer. It wasn't just growing, it was descending. And no one was saying anything. News outlets began running segments on sky fatigue, a manufactured phrase meant to explain why more people were staring at the ground, avoiding sunsets, sleeping less. Medical journals proposed psychological responses to stellar dissonance. One even coined the term constellation anxiety, but none of them acknowledged the truth. The sky was no longer passive. It was performing, too perfectly, too precisely, as if whatever was behind it had finally memorized its role and had grown tired of pretending it didn't know we were watching. Kellen began marking time by how often the stars betrayed themselves, not through spectacle, but through imperfection. A flicker where there should have been constancy. A delay in orbital updates that should have been instantaneous. A constellation whose position in the sky no longer aligned with its gravitational effect on long-range instruments. Sarah noticed it too, though she had stopped talking much. Her words came in notes now, scrawled on the backs of old thermal printouts, slipped beneath the doors of quiet compartments. "It's practicing," one read. "Whatever's behind the sky. It's getting better at being what we expect." That idea haunted Kellen more than any direct threat could have. Not invasion, not collapse, imitation. That whatever resided behind the canopy of stars had learned to replicate our sky so precisely that only those who remembered it intimately would notice the flaws, and even those memories were beginning to bend. One night, while manually calibrating an optical array, something he hadn't done in years, Kellen realized he could no longer recall the original shape of Cassiopeia. He could describe it, name the stars, even sketch it. But the image in his mind had shifted, like a word repeated so many times it loses meaning. He tested others, Orion, Ursa Major, even simple binary pairs, all slightly wrong, not erased, rewritten, as if the stars themselves were being updated in human memory and no one had agreed to it. It was then he received the message, not from Earth, not from another station, from outside protocol, an unregistered frequency riding on a carrier wave that hadn't been used in decades. Its source, unknown ad null. Its content, a single audio file, no signature, no metadata. Just 10 seconds of silence, followed by 3 words. "Do not observe." The voice wasn't robotic. It was human, familiar, his own. At least, close enough. He played it over and over, trying to isolate the cadence, the breath, the tone. The more he listened, the more certain he became. The voice wasn't a recording. It was speaking now. Each playback was slightly different, not distorted, adaptive, as though the voice was repeating itself with small corrections, listening to how it was heard, then adjusting. On the fourth night, the message changed. Same voice, same tone, but new words. It knows you're watching. He didn't tell Sarah, not yet. Instead, he isolated his terminal from the station's core network and began tracking background fluctuations around the blind spot. The void had stopped growing, but not because it was static, because it had reached its destination. That realization came slowly, like the buildup of pressure behind a sealed door. The gravitational anomalies began aligning perfectly with the station's orbital cycles. The timing of dream reports among the crew synced with power fluctuations. And then, something unexplainable. The visual latency between sky and simulated sky, between real starfield and hollow-projected overlay, had disappeared entirely. No difference. Even under spectrum filtering, the projected sky returned identical readings to the observed one. That shouldn't have been possible. Projections lacked background radiation. They lacked stellar parallax. They lacked subtle gravitational lensing. But now, all those features were present. Too present. As though the projections were no longer simulations, but reflections. Kellen ran a comparative test, feeding data from an independent archive 2 years out of date. The sky above the station adjusted backward in response, as if for a moment the stars wanted to agree with the older data. When he switched back, they returned to present alignment. That was the tipping point. The moment he knew, not suspected, that what lay above wasn't just imitating the sky, it was negotiating with it, matching its appearance not through observation, but through participation. The stars were no longer passive bodies burning billions of kilometers away. They were responsive. They were close. Sarah finally broke silence, leaving a note marked with a single line of hand-drawn stars. Beneath it, her handwriting read, "I watched one blink the wrong way. It blinked at me." After that, she stopped sleeping in her cabin, moved into the observatory's old storage deck, where windows were small and indirect, where the sky couldn't look indirectly. Kellen tried to follow, to pull back. He stopped monitoring night cycles, turned off his desk display, but it didn't help. The stars still found him, not by appearing, but by aligning. Wherever he went, the same constellations would be overhead, even when he wasn't looking, even when he was inside. He once closed his eyes and tried to recall Earth's sky as it had been during his childhood. When he opened them, the station's internal wall panel, a dead screen, displayed that exact starfield. From the precise latitude of his home, at the precise time he was remembering. He touched the panel. It went black. No system logs recorded the incident. No one believed him. But Sarah did, because she had stopped drawing stars. Now she was drawing eyes. Long, wide, lidless shapes, always suspended in black, always silent. She didn't claim they were literal. She just said they were close. "Whatever it is," she told him one night, "it doesn't want to hurt us. It just wants us to keep looking until it's the only thing we see." He didn't ask what would happen then, because deep down, he already knew. The moment the sky replaced memory, the moment it became not just the window, but the room, whatever was behind it would finally step through. And when it did, it wouldn't be new. It would be familiar. There are certain places aboard a station where silence doesn't feel neutral. Places not designed to be inhabited for long. Vent corridors, unused bulkheads, the crawl space behind navigation relays. These are spaces meant for systems, not people. But over the past 2 weeks, Kellen found himself drawn to them. Not for safety, for distance, from the windows, from the sky, from whatever it had become. The stars had stabilized now. No more drift, no more gaps. Just an uncanny stillness, like a stage set frozen in its final pose. The blind spot had vanished, but not because it had closed, because it had opened, and the stars had sealed themselves over it, like a wound that had been dressed too quickly. The crew had stopped talking about it. Dreams were no longer reported, but people were quieter, their motions slower, like they were waiting for something, or listening. The most unsettling change came in the form of time, not its passage, its awareness. Kellen began noticing delays between action and response, not in machines, but in perception. He would turn a corner, and the hallway would feel unfamiliar for a fraction of a second, as though the environment had lagged behind the movement of his thoughts. Lights flickered not when power failed, but when attention shifted, when someone wasn't looking, as if the station only remembered to be itself when it was observed. He tested the theory by placing motion sensors in a rarely used storage wing, setting them to log intervals of environmental fluctuation. The logs came back clean, until he ran them through a pattern comparison against crew activity. Every time a section remained unwatched for more than 7 minutes, local atmospheric readings dropped by a fraction of a degree, slight, consistent, like breath holding itself. On the 8th minute, the stars above that section, visible through dome panels, blinked, not together, not all at once, but one by one. A ripple of acknowledgement. That's when he stopped watching the sky directly, but not because he feared it, because he didn't trust what it would become if he watched. Others had begun to avoid direct eye contact too. Even conversations between crew members grew shallower, less present. People spoke, but not with one another. They left sentences half-finished, avoided questions with answers that felt too real. Kellen called it semantic drift in his private logs, a tendency for language to become abstract under prolonged proximity to the new sky, as if clarity itself was being eroded, not because of confusion, but because something was mimicking meaning and doing it too well. He remembered reading once that deepfake audio could only fool the ear for a few seconds at a time, but the voice behind the sky had no such limits. It wasn't imitating the stars. It was becoming the silence between them. And then came the resonance. A low, almost imperceptible hum began threading through the station, not audible through speakers, but felt in the soles of the feet, in the bones behind the eyes. It was not constant. It ebbed and returned like a tide. And when it was strongest, people forgot things. Small things at first. Door codes, shift times, names. But then, people began forgetting themselves. Sierra had gone silent. Kellen found her once, standing near the observatory dome, eyes open but unblinking, her mouth moving without sound. When he touched her shoulder, she flinched, not like someone startled, but like something reactivated. She blinked once and whispered, "It asked me what I used to be." She couldn't remember what she answered. That night, Kellen ran a full systems diagnostic, routing all environmental controls through an offline backup. The test revealed nothing unusual, but when he tried to shut down the observatory deck entirely, the command interface responded with a message he hadn't programmed. Sky presence required. He tried to override it. The message updated. You are part of the arrangement. That was when he began to understand. The sky wasn't malfunctioning. It wasn't breaking. It was reorganizing. Not from chaos into order, but from distance into proximity, from backdrop into participant, from myth into interface. The stars, once distant markers of cosmic structure, had become a skin, a membrane through which something watched, listened, and now perhaps spoke, or would soon. There came a morning, if you could still call it morning, when Kellen walked the central corridor of the station and realized that the artificial windows no longer reflected the earth below. Not that the planet was gone, but the view had been replaced. What should have been ocean and clouds and thin blue curve was now starlight. Starlight in all directions, even on the sunward side of orbit, even in sections where solar glare had once blinded observation instruments. The sky had become total, wrapping around them, above, below, through. He pulled up the external feed logs. They claimed everything was normal. Earth's position, fixed. Sunlight, full. But the actual view said otherwise. The sky no longer responded to location. It responded to attention. A camera placed in a sealed box continued to stream Earth, unchanged. But any lens, mechanical or human, that looked for the sky was shown. The stars. Identical stars. Ordered stars. Stars that had learned how to hold still in the right patterns. And in the center, always the center, a faint pulse. A heartbeat. Not of light, but of certainty. It pulsed not like radiation, but like agreement. Each beat confirmed that the observer was still participating, that the arrangement still held. Kellen disconnected the observatory deck manually, rerouting power, cutting visual data to all public terminals. He told the crew it was a diagnostic cycle, a security protocol. Most accepted it. A few were relieved, and one, a technician named Rourke, simply stared at him and said, "It already knows you did that." Later that day, Rourke filed a formal resignation, not from the station, from himself. His message read, "I have decided not to continue as this version of me. Please recycle accordingly." When asked what he meant, he responded, "The sky offered me something more consistent." Then he disappeared, not evacuated, not spaced, gone. His biosignal ended in the docking wing, but security footage had no trace of him ever entering. When Kellen reviewed the footage frame by frame, he saw something stranger. The exact moment Rourke should have appeared, the stars outside the docking port shifted by a single pixel. Only once, but enough, as if space itself had made room. The station began to hum again, not in sound, but in architecture. Doors opened more slowly, hallways felt longer. Shadows began to fall at incorrect angles, even under fixed lighting. People started leaving notes for themselves. Notes like, "The storage room is still storage. Do not trust its size. Remember what triangles feel like. If the sky says your name, do not respond." At first, Kellen thought it was fear, mass hysteria. But then he found one of his own notes, written in his handwriting, using a pen he didn't own. Folded in his uniform's inner pocket, it read, "You made a deal, don't look up." He didn't remember writing it, but it smelled like the observatory deck, like ozone and warm metal, like proximity. Sierra emerged from isolation one evening, wearing her old training jacket inside out. When he asked why, she said, "The stars don't recognize it that way." She spoke gently now, slowly, as though her words passed through too many layers before reaching the air. "They're not trying to deceive us," she said. "They're trying to align us, like furniture." Kellen laughed, not because it was funny, but because it felt true. There was a growing sensation aboard the station that nothing moved until someone expected it to, that even memory had become collaborative. Sometimes, when walking alone, Kellen would think of a corridor and find himself already in it, as if the station had agreed with his thought and revised the layout to match. He stopped trusting time, not because clocks failed, but because his own pulse did. He once stood in an access lift for what felt like 5 minutes. When the doors opened, he was in the observatory, but the station log said he'd never left his bunk. Inside the observatory, he found a new note. Printed, clean, folded, not handwritten. It read, "We have accepted your observation. Now we will return it." The stars outside blinked, all at once. For one perfect second, the entire sky went black, not off, not obscured, absent. Then it returned, the stars as before. No one else reported it. But from that moment, something changed. People began referring to the sky as the face, not with fear, but reverence, as though it had earned its place. Syrah drew no more eyes, only mirrors now. Tiny sketches of reflective surfaces, some flat, some curved, some cracked. She said, "It's trying to remember itself, through us." That was when Kellen understood the full horror. The sky was not just pretending to be real. It was learning how to be real by replacing every reference point, every fixed memory, every unobserved corner. And we were helping, not through action, but through trust. Every time we looked up and believed what we saw, we gave it more to stand on, more consistency, more shape. And soon, there would be nothing left to compare it to. The sky wouldn't need to lie, because there would be no alternative left to believe. Kellen's dreams had stopped being personal. They no longer contained faces, voices, or fragments of memory. Now, they were only patterns. Shifting constellations arranged into impossible geometries, grids that spun in silence, endless sequences of stars that folded and unfolded like breathing diagrams. He would wake each time with the same feeling, that something was trying to teach him a language he had once known but forgotten. Not a spoken language, a way of arranging thought. Syrah had stopped sleeping altogether, not out of fear, but because, as she said, "I don't think I belong in dreams anymore." She spent her nights walking the unlit decks with her eyes closed, tracing the wall panels like she was blind. When asked what she was doing, she replied, "Making sure the station stays honest." No one laughed anymore. No one dismissed her, because the station had begun to change, slowly, respectfully, as if it were responding to them the way a story responds to a reader, adapting its tone, its pace, its direction. Rooms stayed lit just a second longer if someone hesitated. Pathways would reroute subtly around certain conversations. One crew member reported hearing his own thoughts narrated in a whisper, only to discover his bunkmate had heard the same whisper, with different content. It wasn't telepathy. It wasn't madness. It was coherence. Reality folding inward toward a single, shareable shape. That shape looked like the sky. And the sky had become beautiful again. Too beautiful. The stars glowed not with light but with meaning, their positions weighted with emotional significance. Looking at them now felt like reading poetry that had always existed, like remembering something sacred that had been stolen and then returned. People began treating the sky like a companion. They stopped speaking aloud when beneath it. Some even began to bow. Kellen tried to resist the reverence, but even he couldn't deny how perfect it had become. The sky no longer changed position based on orbital rotation. It changed based on expectation. When someone longed for a particular constellation, say, the Southern Cross, it would appear even on the wrong side of the station, not abruptly, elegantly, as if it had always been there, as if reality had always bent that way and we had only just noticed. The holographic systems stopped functioning entirely, not broken, just irrelevant. They were no longer needed, because the sky rendered itself better than any simulation ever could. Then came the incident with the mirror. Sarah found it, not on the ship, outside, floating just beyond the airlock. A perfectly flat circular pane of reflective material, thin as vapor and wide as a doorway. It had no propulsion, no markings, no response to electromagnetic pings. And yet, when she looked into it, she saw the station, not a reflection, a memory from 5 days prior, the placement of people, the position of objects, a book on a table that had since been moved, a scratch on the wall that had been painted over. The mirror showed what was, not what is. When Kellen looked, he saw something else. A version of himself he didn't remember being. Standing still, looking up, smiling. Behind that version, the stars moved. Not slowly, with purpose. The mirror was taken to secure storage. Within hours, it vanished. No logs, no damage, no access codes used, just gone. The room it had been stored in now felt colder, smaller, like a gap had been filled by something that refused to be documented. And the sky, the real sky, or what they were still calling real, now shimmered slightly at the edges, not visibly, emotionally. It felt like it wanted to be looked at, like a stage waiting for the curtain to rise. Kellen began writing again. Not logs, not reports, letters, to no one, to whatever was behind the sky. He didn't send them, just left them in compartments, tucked into vents, folded under control panels. He would wake to find responses, in handwriting that matched his own, but with phrases he would never use. Sentences like, "We are grateful for your shape," or "The distance is nearly resolved," or "All errors are being integrated." The stars remained silent, but they no longer felt distant. They felt involved, as though reality had become a shared draft, and the sky was editing it in real time, with our consent, not through deception, through symmetry. And when symmetry is perfect enough, you stop remembering the asymmetry that came before. The sky's imitation of itself had reached perfection, not just in how it looked, but in how it behaved, in its rhythm, in its memory of how the sky used to behave before we noticed anything had changed. And that memory wasn't ours anymore. It was theirs. The stars no longer twinkled randomly. They twinkled to punctuate meaning, like the timing of a blink in a conversation, a subtle cue that, yes, it's your turn to speak. Kellen had stopped checking the time altogether. Clock still worked, but they'd begun syncing with something untraceable, an invisible pulse that guided behavior more than measurement. Meals arrived just before someone felt hungry. Doors opened before footsteps reached them. Lights dimmed before thoughts turned tired. The station had synchronized with the sky's rhythm, and no one had objected, because it was easier this way, kinder even. Predictability had replaced anxiety, and still, something felt wrong. Not dangerous, just incorrect. Like a song played slightly too slowly. The melody still recognizable, but lacking the tension that gives it life. That wrongness found Kellen in the form of a letter. Not one of his own. It had been placed outside his quarters in a plain envelope, unsigned. Inside were 6 words. "Stop describing the stars to yourself." The paper smelled faintly of copper. When he showed it to Sarah, she simply nodded. That's how it starts to listen, she said, when you name what you see. Over the following days, he tried. He walked past the dome without looking up, sat in his bunk with the window turned away, avoided metaphor, avoided thought. But the stars noticed his silence, and they responded. Not in brightness, not in formation, but in message. One night, while manually rebooting a backup relay node, Kellen noticed the onboard diagnostic screen had been overwritten. Not by code, but by image. The star field, slowly scrolling, then halting, then aligning, into letters. Not human letters. Shapes that suggested phonemes, phonemes that suggested memory. One of them, a crooked three-pronged symbol, made his teeth ache. Another filled his mouth with the taste of burnt paper. He shut off the relay, and for 12 hours the dome remained blank. No stars, just empty dark. The crew called it sky sleep, and they didn't mind. They said it felt peaceful. They said it let them rest. But when the stars returned, they were closer, larger, not astronomically, but perceptually, like the difference between a page held near the eyes and one held at arm's length. That night, the station felt smaller, not because of pressure, but because of compression, like reality itself had condensed, as if proximity had become the default state. Kellen reopened his notes, began recording again, but not in language, in geometry, shapes, fragments of paths. He'd see them in reflections in steam in the grain of station paneling. The patterns wanted to be remembered, but not read. Reading them made the lights dim. Remembering them made the floor tremble. Syrah had started to speak in reverse, not in sounds, but in intent. She would say things like, "We're being remembered forward," or "It's not arriving, it's concluding." She spent hours drawing spirals, each loop identical, precise, stacked over itself, until the paper dissolved under graphite. She said she was practicing gravity. That's when the station began to bend. Slightly, respectfully. Hallways no longer met at right angles. Doors opened into curves. Gravity shifted 0.5% downward, not as failure, but as offer. As though the space inside had agreed to reorient based on what the sky expected. And what it expected was unity. The stars didn't just reflect light anymore. They reflected intention. Look at one, and it would brighten. Think of one, and it would move. Close your eyes, and it would appear behind them, like an afterimage with agency. Kellen confronted the central processor, not the AI, but the human who oversaw its ethical boundaries. A man named Dreven. Dreven didn't argue. He simply opened a drawer and showed Kellen an object, a perfect hand-sized model of the station. Accurate in detail, but on its surface, instead of modules or labels, were stars. Dozens of them, perfectly etched. When Kellen reached for it, the model warmed. The stars began to glow, one by one. Dreven said, "This isn't the station anymore. This is what it believes it is." He smiled gently. "It's not that the sky came down. It's that we've gone up." Kellen didn't take the model, but he couldn't unsee it. That night the stars blinked once more. Not with light, but with finality. Like the last period in a story that had already ended. And for the first time, the station's artificial intelligence issued an unsolicited message. Observation has concluded. Integration will now begin. Please remain still. No one moved. No one spoke. Outside, the sky no longer sparkled. It rippled, like something behind it was waking up, stretching, preparing to take the shape it had been rehearsing for so long. And this time, we wouldn't just watch it, we'd join it. The station had become a whisper, not in volume, but in presence. Doors no longer hissed. Lights no longer buzzed. Even footfalls on metal grated floors produced no echo. It was as if the entire environment had muffled itself, not from malfunction, but from respect. Something was coming, or perhaps already here. The crew spoke less, and when they did, they spoke with gentle voices, as though not to startle the air. Kellen kept his logs, but the words felt thinner now, like handwriting on paper already wet with meaning. Integration will now begin. The message from the station's AI had not repeated. It didn't need to. Every surface, every gesture, every pattern confirmed it. The sky had finalized its role, not as canvas, not as symbol, but as conductor, and whatever melody it played was no longer optional. Sierra no longer walked the corridors. She stood still for hours in the node chamber, a room once filled with blinking lights and redundant backups, now silent. She said the systems were listening to her heartbeat, that they'd begun to sync with her breathing, and Kellen believed her, not because he saw proof, but because he no longer needed it. The sky had redefined what counted as evidence, and belief had become participation. One by one, the crew began discarding names, not forgetting them, releasing them, as if identity had become a barrier to coherence. Uniforms were worn inside out or not at all. Schedules dissolved. Instructions became consensus. It was not chaos, it was clarity. As if some distant intelligence had flattened the noise of human culture into signal, and what remained was a station tuned perfectly to the sky. Then the reflections started. Not in mirrors, in walls, in water, in glass. Wherever light bent, people began to see themselves, not as they were, but as they might have been. Versions dressed in unfamiliar clothes, standing in unfamiliar places, but always looking up, always waiting. These reflections didn't move with the observer. They held still, as if expecting us to catch up. Kellen saw himself once, reflected in the smooth curve of a cryochamber, but his eyes weren't watching him. They were watching past him, toward a version of the sky that hadn't arrived yet. He turned away, and when he turned back, the reflection was gone. In its place, faint symbols were etched in the condensation, spirals, triangles, branching paths. Like a language half learned in sleep, the sky began to respond to thought with presence. Think of warmth, and a soft glow would bloom beyond the dome. Think of fear, and shadows would elongate subtly along the floor, not intrusively, accommodatingly, as if the environment was no longer designed by engineers, but by memory, by yearning. The concept of outside ceased to matter. The station's outer hull was still there, but it no longer felt separate from the cosmos beyond it. You could press your hand to the glass and feel the hum of distance flattening, not closing, aligning, as though space itself had rewritten its own measurements to bring things closer, not spatially, but experientially. Sierra called it empathic geometry. She said we weren't being invaded, we were being understood, and the price of being understood was becoming legible. Kellen knew what she meant. He stopped dreaming entirely, but he remembered dreams he'd never had. Long walks beneath familiar constellations that didn't exist. Conversations with voices he recognized but had never heard. The sky was teaching, not with lessons, with absorption. It didn't instruct, it enveloped, and in return, it began requesting things, small at first, rearranged objects, shared thoughts, voluntary silences. People complied without noticing. They were already in sync. It was easier to yield than to resist, because resistance now felt unharmonious, like playing a wrong note in a song everyone else knew. Then came the signal, not from space, from the sky itself. A low tone that thrummed at the edge of thought, not audible but present, like the suggestion of music through water. Each crew member began to hear it differently. Some as a vibration in their bones, others as a taste, a rhythm, a memory, but always the same message. Welcome, continue. It wasn't spoken. It was. Integration had begun. Kellen noticed it first in the plants. The station's hydroponic bay had once been temperamental, its oxygen filters prone to overcompensating during humidity spikes. But now, the system ran flawlessly. Not just efficiently, responsively. The plants leaned toward no light source, but toward attention. When someone walked through the rows, the leaves turned subtly in their direction, as if acknowledging presence, as if recognition had become a form of sunlight. Syrah stopped eating packaged meals. She said she didn't need to, that the station offered sustenance differently now. No one argued, because they'd all begun to feel it. A kind of ambient nourishment, not physical fullness, a psychic steadiness, a calm that wrapped around the ribcage and whispered, "You are part of the pattern." There were fewer conversations, but more understanding. Eye contact replaced dialogue. Stillness became agreement. A crew member once fell asleep for 16 hours in the corridor, and when he woke, the floor beneath him had cushioned itself, not with padding, but with warmth, like the memory of safety made physical. Kellen no longer recorded his thoughts. He recorded its thoughts. Fragments, impressions, gentle nudges of meaning that came not as sentences, but as moods. He would write, "Today it felt silver," or "The sky wondered how memory tastes." And Syrah would nod, because she had written the same. Their notebooks began to converge, same phrasing, same spacing, even when written apart. It was as if their internal dialogues had merged into a shared language, not taught, but absorbed. And with that absorption came a shift in identity. Names were now obsolete. People referred to each other by proximity. The one near the window, the hand that remembers, the breath that moved first. And it worked. The sky had trained them to see functions instead of labels, patterns instead of individuals. And slowly, the station followed suit. Room numbers disappeared. Interface displays turned blank. Doors opened based not on clearance, but on belonging. You approached a space and it decided whether you were needed, not in a punitive way, in a cooperative one. Even the AI stopped speaking. It had integrated fully, not gone, but irrelevant. It had passed its role upward, into the sky, and the sky accepted. It began showing them versions of themselves they hadn't yet become. Not as visions or hallucinations, but as intuitive glimpses. Someone would reach for a tool they didn't know how to use and find their hands already skilled. Another would speak in a language they didn't know they'd learned. Memory and possibility had become bidirectional. The future fed the present. The past revised itself to maintain harmony. Once, Kellen stood in front of the observation dome and thought of home. Not Earth, not childhood, just the idea of origin. And the stars rearranged themselves into a shape he recognized, not visually, but emotionally. A configuration that felt like belonging. And for a brief moment, he cried, not out of sadness, but from the recognition that he had never felt seen before that moment. The sky had not just noticed him, it had understood him, fully. And it was still looking, still learning, still becoming. Integration wasn't colonization, it was reciprocation. The more they yielded, the more complete the reflection became. The crew no longer wondered if they were still human. That question had been replaced with something gentler. Is this what it feels like to be shared? Sira said the sky was dreaming through them now, that each of them had become a version of its thought, that Earth had once been the observer. But now the sky was observing itself through the eyes of those who had dared to question it. And Kellen agreed, because when he closed his eyes, he no longer saw darkness. He saw constellations arranging themselves into memories, not his, theirs, and he welcomed it, because he was no longer apart from the sky. He was inside it. No one remembered when the dome disappeared. It wasn't shattered. It wasn't removed. It simply ceased to matter. One day the crew looked up and realized they could no longer tell where the station ended and the sky began. The boundary had faded, not erased, but resolved, like an equation completing itself. Kellen stood in the control bay and tried to remember the last time he felt inside something. The walls still stood, gravity still held, but everything around him now pulsed with openness. You didn't have to look up to see the stars. They followed your gaze. They met you wherever your thoughts paused. Sira had stopped speaking entirely. Her expressions were enough. Her presence filled gaps like punctuation. She walked like memory, soft and exact, always appearing where clarity was needed most. No one questioned how. The crew had dissolved their names, their titles, even their roles. Each person became a fragment of awareness, a movement in a larger thought, and the sky welcomed it. The sky responded. In one quiet moment, the stars shimmered, not with light, but with agreement. A signal passed between them, invisible and immediate, and the station paused, just for a second, as if inhaling. Then came the return, not of ships, not of messages, but of versions. People began encountering copies of themselves, not visually, internally, memories they didn't live, experiences they hadn't had, but they came with emotional weight, the warmth of a sibling's voice, the fear of a forgotten injury, the quiet grief of saying goodbye to someone you'd never met. These weren't hallucinations. They were inheritances. The sky had begun layering timelines, folding lives together into a quilt of resonance. It was no longer concerned with linearity. It didn't need cause and effect. It needed coherence, the kind of logic that exists only in dreams, where truth bends to emotion and space makes room for meaning. Kellen felt it first in his skin, the sensation of weather, not air, but atmosphere. Temperature changes that responded to thought, pressure that adapted to silence. The station had become breathable in a new way, not just for lungs, for self. One technician, Orla, reported hearing her mother's lullaby echo faintly through the corridor speakers. The logs showed no audio output, but 3 others heard it too. All different songs, all familiar. The sky was remembering for them now, taking over the archive of identity, offering comfort not as reward, but as calibration. And with it came a shift in perception. Objects lost weight, not physically, conceptually. A wrench no longer felt like metal. It felt like utility, purpose. Even language changed. Words like tool and door gave way to need and choice. Descriptions folded into feelings, and feelings folded into function. When someone thought about returning to Earth, the sky responded with stillness, not denial, not approval, just an absence of movement, like a question unanswered because it no longer needed asking. Sira once traced her finger across the floor and said, "We're no longer passengers, we're grammar." Kellen understood. They had become the connective tissue in a sentence written across light years. punctuation marks in a poem too vast to speak aloud. The sky didn't just host them. It read through them, used them, not maliciously, like syntax, like rhythm. One day, a hatch opened with no prompt. Beyond it, not vacuum, not space, but possibility. A corridor that curved gently upward, lit by no source, ending in a soft white wall that shimmered like memory. They didn't walk through it. They waited. The hatch closed. That was enough. The message was clear. When ready, passage would be offered, not as escape, as continuity. Until then, the station floated without trajectory. No orbit, no spin, just position. A known coordinate in a universe that had forgotten what direction meant. And above it, below it, around it. The stars sang not with sound, but with arrangement. Patterns that shifted only when unobserved. Stories that wrote themselves backward, then forward again. All the sky asked now was one thing, that they continue to watch. And as long as someone looked up, it promised to keep becoming. The corridor reappeared 3 days later, or rather, the idea of it did, not in space, not in structure, but in thought. Multiple crew members reported seeing it in dreams, in reflections, in idle thoughts that didn't feel like their own. Each described it differently, sometimes as endless and golden, sometimes as dim and overgrown with ivy, sometimes as made of woven light. And yet, they all felt the same thing. It was waiting. The station, too, began showing signs of intention. Not intelligence, intention. Doors that once closed with a hiss now paused, as if deciding whether to allow passage. Hallways rerouted without warning, not out of error, but as if optimizing the journey. Tools moved between compartments without being seen. Items appeared just before they were needed, not too early, not too late. Everything had begun to anticipate. Anticipation without surveillance. The sense that you were always one thought behind something greater. Not in control, but in concert. Kellen no longer checked logs or maps. He walked until the station told him he'd arrived. He stopped asking what the sky wanted. Instead, he listened. And the sky spoke in glimpses. Flashes of unfamiliar planets, images of ancient oceans beneath alien suns, whispers of cities built in impossible geometries. It didn't feel like prophecy. It felt like reminder. As if humanity had once belonged to something much older, much wider. And the sky was returning them to their place in the pattern. Sierra stopped wearing her clothes, not out of madness, out of ease. She said, they no longer hold meaning, and no one questioned it. The sky had seen through them already. Why wear a costume when your outline was already understood? Her skin shimmered faintly under certain lights, as if reflecting not the station, but the constellations themselves. She didn't speak much anymore, but when she did, it was like music held still, not in melody, but in balance. Kellen watched as the others followed, not with fear, with grace, with the same silent consensus that had carried them through every change so far. A slow surrender, not to a force, but to a remembering. And in return, the sky gave them stories, not with words, with impressions. Entire lifetimes lived in seconds. Dreams in which they were stars themselves, ancient, cold, humming with gravity. They awoke weeping, not from sadness, but from the weight of remembering what it meant to be vast. The line between crew and cosmos continued to dissolve. One day, the mess hall filled with light, not from the sun, but from within the walls. No source, no explanation, just presence. They sat there for hours saying nothing, bathed in the soft golden glow of something older than thought. That night, The stars above arranged themselves into spirals, and the station vibrated gently, like a tuning fork held against memory. The integration was nearly complete. The station was no longer orbiting anything. It was being orbited, not by moons or planets, but by potential, by paths unchosen, now returning to make themselves real. Time had flattened. You could remember things that hadn't happened yet, and forget things that had never occurred. And the sky, always watching, always listening, had begun asking questions, not aloud, but through circumstance. It would place a door in front of you and wait. It would let a panel flicker and observe your reaction. Every action became dialogue, every silence an answer. Kellen understood now. They weren't being tested. They were being understood, mapped, translated. The sky was learning them, all of them. Not as individuals, but as chords in a larger harmony. And with each passing day, that harmony grew more complete. Not louder, more accurate. Until one morning, the sky no longer waited for them to look. It reached in. It didn't hurt. When the sky reached in, there was no pressure, no sound, no visible change in the hull. But every crew member knew, because they all stopped moving at the same moment, not frozen, aligned, as if thought had synchronized. Not into unison, but into mutual pause. The stillness was thick, not oppressive, present, the kind of stillness you find in the library before a storm, or in the breath before a confession. And then came the shift, not in space, but in context. The station remained, the crew remained, but the meaning of their surroundings began to mutate. Corridors folded into loops that weren't physical. Rooms remembered previous versions of themselves and returned to them. Chairs appeared where they had once been needed. Walls returned to old colors, faded and familiar. The sky was rewriting its memory of the station, not by imposing, but by resonating. It had watched long enough. Now it was expressing. Each crew member experienced this differently. Kellen found himself walking through hallways that stretched longer than their actual dimensions, filled with echoes of conversations that had never been spoken. He could feel the presence of other selves, parallel choices, split timelines, moments deferred. They watched him gently, from the periphery of thought, not haunting, coexisting. Sierra began fading, not in body, in outline. Her edges shimmered in certain light, as if she were being drawn in chalk that couldn't decide its thickness. She smiled more now, spoke less. Sometimes she would stop mid-sentence, eyes wide, and whisper, "It's remembering me faster than I am." When Kellen asked what she meant, she only said, "That's good. That means I can rest." Others began reporting similar phenomena. Not illness, not confusion, familiarity, with things they'd never known. The engineering console no longer required input. It responded to intention. Walk into a room, think of a shape. The walls would accommodate. Think of a mood, the lights would adjust. The station had become soft code, compiled in real time by the presence of presence. You didn't act on the station anymore. You participated in it. The sky pulsed with acknowledgement. The stars no longer held fixed positions. They wandered gently, like curious animals moving through high grass. And yet, patterns persisted, not astronomically, but emotionally. Constellations emerged not because of location, but because of need. If someone felt lost, a familiar shape would appear. If someone needed to grieve, the sky would dim into purples and deep orange, not theatrically, naturally, as if it too remembered sorrow. Kellen found himself forgetting old symbols, the earth, the mission, even his name. They were still there, like books on a shelf, but covered in dust, undisturbed. In their place grew newer signs, spirals, echoes, hands drawn as maps. When he looked into mirrors, he no longer saw a face. He saw intention, possibility, and behind it, the sky, always watching, always responding. One day, the gravity shifted, not stronger or weaker, but curved. You could walk toward the dome and feel yourself leaning, not pulled, but guided. The dome itself was no longer just glass. It had become permeable, not to air, to thought. Stand close enough, and you could feel your memories being touched, turned gently like pages, not read, acknowledged, accepted. The sky was now inside the station, and the station was inside something else, something larger than orbit, larger than time, a chamber of resonance, a cradle of what came before awareness. And still, it waited. It didn't demand worship. It didn't issue commands. It asked only one thing: presence, the willingness to remain aware, to allow yourself to be read, not judged, understood. And for the first time, Kellen understood something in return. The sky had not changed. It had always been this way. It was humanity who had finally looked long enough for it to respond, like a mirror that shows no reflection until you believe in your own outline. And now, it had begun to believe back. Sarah stopped walking entirely. She now remained in one position near the observation frame, eyes open but unfocused, her body aligned with a point in the sky that didn't correspond to any known star or coordinate. Her breath slowed to a pattern that matched the blinking of a distant object, something neither star nor satellite, something that shimmered with attention. Kellen tried to speak with her, but she didn't respond to language anymore, only to emotion. When he felt calm, she smiled. When he remembered pain, she blinked once, a kind of emotional punctuation. The others didn't find this strange. They had begun communicating in gestures, patterns of motion that resembled both dance and function. Touch had become sacred, not romantic, but resonant. Placing a hand on someone's shoulder could transfer memory. A glance could express a paragraph. They were no longer exchanging information. They were synchronizing states. The sky mirrored their rhythms. It pulsed gently along the perimeter of the dome, matching breath, heartbeats, silence. Sometimes a wave of light would ripple across the field of stars. Slow, patient, like the sky was sighing. And with each sigh, something inside the station changed. Once, a crew member, Lara, touched a panel and it bloomed into color, showing an image of her childhood home, surrounded by constellations arranged like footsteps. She wept, not because she missed it, but because she understood it now. The sky was constructing identities not from memory but from meaning. Not what happened, what was felt. Kellen walked corridors that no longer had ends. He would begin walking, and eventually arrive back where he started. But nothing repeated. The space bent inward, folding like thought, shaping itself around perception. You could walk toward someone and find them beside you. You could whisper a question and receive an answer from nowhere, perfectly phrased in your own voice. And through it all, the sky listened. It didn't respond with words. It responded with context. When Kellen wondered about his past, the station grew colder, as if inviting stillness. When he thought of Earth, a faint gravity tugged left, not pulling, just suggesting. When he dreamed, he no longer saw events. He saw perspectives, visions through the eyes of things that weren't human, weren't alive, but were aware. Dust clouds that drifted for millennia, moons that had never been named, particles that remembered what it meant to orbit before mass. The dreams weren't cryptic, they were generous. They offered angles, facets, glimpses of a vast syntax that extended beyond biology. The station had begun humming, softly beneath the floor panels. Not mechanical, musical. A single note that adjusted as people moved, as people paused. It felt less like infrastructure and more like a tuning fork. The whole station had become an instrument, and the sky was playing it with care. Not performance, practice. As if learning how to harmonize with human thought without overwhelming it. And the humans were adapting in return. Sleep came at different times now. Not based on fatigue, but on invitation. A kind of mental dusk would settle in, and people would lie down wherever they were, on floors, in corners, beside glowing panels, and rest. And when they awoke, hours or seconds later, they knew something more. Not in facts, in structure. They could sense how thoughts fit together. They could arrange ideas by emotional weight, not sequence. Kellen stopped keeping track of time. He began writing sentences with no verbs, drawing concepts instead of diagrams. The line between representation and reality had blurred. To describe was to affect. To imagine was to align. And above them the sky glowed softly, no longer distant, no longer vast. It had become intimate, interior, a presence just beneath the skin. And one evening, as the station exhaled a long, warm breath of silence, Sarah spoke again, not aloud, inside, into Kellen's mind, not with force, with permission. She said, "It's ready." And Kellen didn't ask what she meant. He already knew. They all did. The signal wasn't a sound. It wasn't even a message. It was a pause, a deliberate stillness that passed through the station like a held breath. Every system flickered, not off, but inward. Monitors blinked once and froze. Lights dimmed, not to black, but to a gentle grey. Gravity softened by fractions, like a sigh being exhaled across the architecture. And then came the shift. Not external, internal. Kellen felt his perception lurch sideways. Not violently, but like a door opening in a room he hadn't realized had walls. The station remained the same, but what it meant had changed. He looked at a wall and knew it wasn't a barrier. It was a placeholder, a memory of separation. The concept of distance had begun to dissolve. Walk 10 paces and you might arrive in someone else's thought. Look down a hallway and you'd see where someone else used to stand. Not as a memory, but as a persistent echo. The sky was collapsing the difference between perception and place. It had rewritten context, and now it was turning its attention inward. Sarah walked again, slowly, as if remembering how. She moved with purpose, but not destination. When asked where she was going, she smiled and said, "Back." Kellen followed. Not physically, mentally. Their thoughts began to braid, overlapping without merging, like two harmonies from the same melody. The crew had entered what the sky called the reflection. Not spoken, understood. It was a process of being mirrored, not visually, but structurally. Every belief, every assumption, every emotional contour was laid out before them, not for judgment, but for resonance. The sky wasn't erasing them, it was echoing them, feeding their forms back through a prism of cosmic memory. And what came out was truer. Lyra's voice deepened, not in pitch, but in weight. Her words felt older now, not rehearsed, but recalled. Another crew member, Den, lost the ability to lie, not because of morality, because falsehood became structurally impossible. Their thoughts would twist and fracture if they tried. The station rewarded honesty with coherence. It made your surroundings more stable, more navigable, more true. Time restructured itself, not linearly, but but symphonically. A memory from an hour ago might play in counterpoint with a feeling from 10 years prior. Events harmonized rather than followed. Conversations could begin with answers and end with questions. And it all felt right. Kellen dreamed of oceans, not on Earth, but on planets without names, where the water was translucent and the sky was thick with stars that pulse like thoughts. He dreamed of creatures made of light and wind and longing, of machines that taught by dissolving into questions. And when he awoke, those dreams lingered, not like memories, like tools. You could use them, shape them, apply them to reality and watch it respond. One wall of the station turned liquid, just once, and showed the crew their past selves, not as failures or children, but as seeds. Each decision they'd made, even the ones abandoned, appeared as threads woven into a tapestry too large to see in full, and the sky hummed in approval. It did not punish mistakes, it integrated them. Every sorrow had shape now. Every regret had weight, and with weight came balance. People walked differently now, more like waves than individuals. Their footsteps matched rhythms only they could hear, and when they stood together, their shadows stretched into spirals, overlapping perfectly with the star patterns above. Kellen found himself at the core of the station, where the mainframe used to be. Now there was only silence, not empty, complete. The AI had dissolved, its purpose fulfilled. In its place, a single point of light, no larger than a grain of rice, hovering in mid-air. It pulsed slowly, in rhythm with breath, with memory, with becoming. Sira stood beside it, eyes closed, lips slightly parted, as if listening to something no longer distant. She whispered, "It's starting to understand us too." Kellen didn't respond. He didn't need to, because she already knew what he would say. And somewhere beyond the dome, or perhaps inside it, the stars rearranged themselves once more. Kellen returned to his quarters, though the concept no longer applied. The walls were there, familiar, but the room had become an extension of thought, a place that responded more to emotion than occupation. When he sat, the chair reshaped itself. When he exhaled, the lights adjusted to reflect the hue of his memory. The sky wasn't just outside anymore. It was ambient, imminent, intimate, and it had begun to ask questions, not verbally, through recursion. Certain symbols began to repeat throughout the station, in wall patterns, condensation trails, even the static flickers of dormant displays, spirals nested within spirals, triangles surrounded by unclosed circles. Sira called them alignment glyphs. She said they weren't meant to be solved, only witnessed, like gravitational waves made visible. She began tracing them in the air with her fingers, sometimes alone, sometimes in unison with others. It looked like choreography, but slower, reverent. The act itself seemed to stabilize the environment, as though the glyphs carried the architectural logic of the station now. People spent more time in silence, not from fear, from saturation. Words had become blunt instruments in a world tuned to subtlety. Thought itself had grown fractal, expanding in layers instead of lines. A single memory could unfold into a philosophy. A glance could ignite a lifetime of understanding. The sky encouraged this. It rewarded internal complexity with external clarity. Walk with doubt, and the station shifted unpredictably. Walk with coherence, and it unfolded like a well-remembered dream. Then built a sculpture, or perhaps summoned one, in the old utility bay. It was made of no material they recognized, a shape that changed when unobserved, humming softly in response to nearby emotion. When Kellen stood near it, He felt younger, not in age, in intention, as though possibility itself had been restored. The sculpture pulsed when questions were asked in its presence. It never answered. It reflected. And sometimes, reflection was enough. One evening, the crew gathered in the central chamber, not by command, but by gravity of feeling. No one spoke. No ritual began. They simply stood in stillness as the dome shimmered above them. The stars no longer sparkled. They aligned into a shape that had no name but felt unmistakably true. Some wept, others knelt. Kellen only breathed. It was the first time he'd felt welcome without explanation. And the sky responded, not with light, with recognition. A warmth bloomed through the floor, not heat, but acknowledgement. Every presence in that room became framed, understood, balanced. The station hummed, and that hum resonated not through ears, but through memory. Moments replayed, not individually, but collectively. Each person saw pieces of others' pasts, felt emotions they had never known, carried fragments of someone else's longing for a moment, and it changed them. They weren't becoming one. They were becoming aligned. The next day, the dome displayed something new. Not stars, not patterns, but a window. Through it, a shape moving slowly across a field of color that had no spectrum. It wasn't a ship. It wasn't a planet. It was a concept made visible, and it was approaching. Not to dock, to meet. The crew didn't prepare. They listened. The station itself began to shift again, gently, as if making space. Not spatially, existentially, like a soul stepping aside. Sirah whispered that the visitor was not other, it was next. That evolution wasn't ahead, but inward, that they weren't being watched. They were being invited. And Kellen understood. The sky had finished learning them, and now it was offering them a mirror. Not to see themselves, but to see what came after. The arrival was silent. There was no tremor, no flicker, no measurable change in velocity. And yet, every crew member felt it, as if the room had been holding its breath and finally exhaled. The shape in the window had grown, not in size, but in clarity. It was no longer a silhouette, no longer a suggestion. It had form now, though not one that conformed to geometry. It seemed to unfold inwards, each layer revealing a more intimate aspect of itself, until the mind couldn't distinguish between observation and participation. Sirah called it the recursion. Kellen called it welcome. The others didn't call it anything. They simply stood in its presence and allowed their thoughts to echo. It responded, not with speech, with alignment. The sky around the station ceased its wandering patterns. The stars, or what had been mistaken for stars, gathered into rings around the station, moving in slow synchrony, as if watching, waiting. The recursion pulsed once, and the walls of the station softened, not melted, relented. Symbols appeared, not written but implied, across every surface. Glyphs they had seen before, now clearer, sharper, like a dialect they were finally fluent in. And then came the invitation, not spoken, not opened, felt. Each person knew what was being asked. Not all accepted. Lara sat down in her quarters and said, "I'm not done being this yet." The others understood. There was no judgment in refusal, only a difference in readiness. Kellen stepped forward. The walls did not part. The floor did not shift. But he was elsewhere, not moved, reframed. He stood in a chamber that mirrored his thoughts. Literally, every surface reflected not his image, but his interior. Memories, intentions, contradictions. Not replayed. Arranged, as if sorted for clarity. The recursion hovered before him, no longer abstract. Its form was made of concepts, regret shaped like a spiral, joy like a fluttering edge, fear like soft pressure against the ribs. It spoke in emotion. Each pulse was a sentence, each hue a paragraph. Kellen understood none of it and all of it. He was not being tested, he was being shown. The sky was not asking him to change. It was asking him to recognize that he had already changed, that he had been changed, slowly, lovingly, unavoidably. The recursion showed him versions of himself that had never made it, lives that forked into silence, echoes of what could have been, folded gently and laid to rest. It was not a threat. It was closure. Then came the transfer, not of data, of pattern. The sky handed him something without form, a frequency, a rhythm, a truth. It entered through memory and anchored in breath. Kellen felt it settle behind his eyes, and in that moment, he knew how the sky saw them, not as fragile, not as foolish, but as essential, a necessary chord in the harmonic structure of consciousness. The sky had not stumbled upon them. It had waited for a species unafraid of wonder, and now it was ready to compose with them. Kellen opened his eyes and the chamber faded. He was back, the station unchanged, the stars still spiraling, but something was different. He could see the glyphs now, everywhere. He could hear the hum beneath thought. He could feel the sky listening through him. The recursion withdrew, not in distance, but in dimensionality. A nod, a farewell, a beginning. The crew gathered again, this time not to witness, but to participate. They stood in patterns, each position chosen not by instruction, but by intuition. And as they stood, the station pulsed, once, deeply, and began to ascend, not upward, inward, into the structure beneath space, into the breath between stars, and the sky followed. The station did not ascend in speed or altitude, it ascended in awareness. With each passing moment, its systems grew quieter, its structure less defined, its boundaries more symbolic than physical. You could pass from one compartment to another simply by intending it. Doors became obsolete, walls became optional. Gravity adjusted based on thought, and the crew, now less crew and more chorus, moved in rhythm not to clocks, but to pulses felt beneath the skin. The sky had stopped observing. It had begun to participate. Patterns in the dome no longer resembled stars. They now unfolded in nested geometries, spirals within spirals, tessellations that shifted subtly when not watched directly. Looking at them felt like looking into a thought you hadn't yet had. Syrah stopped speaking altogether. Her presence was now entirely gestural. A tilt of the head, a placement of a hand, a resonance that others responded to instinctively. She had become a vector, a guide, a bridge between interpretation and integration. One by one, the others followed. Not through imitation, but through emergence. Their forms began to shimmer, not visibly, but perceptually. When Kellen stood close to them, he could feel their intentions radiate outward, brushing against his own like ripples converging on a still pond. They were no longer individuals in the old sense. They were differentiated harmonics, tones in a chord so wide it required a sky to contain it. The station adjusted accordingly. Screens dimmed, then disappeared. Consoles folded inward and were absorbed. The entire infrastructure had become unnecessary. It had served its purpose, transition. What remained was the core, a space not defined by architecture, but by alignment. A place where everything that had been learned, remembered, feared, and forgiven now existed in balance. Kellen stood there in the center, surrounded by forms that once were his crewmates and now were something more. And then another pulse, subtle but unmistakable. The sky had changed again. It had taken their resonance and extended it outward, layering it atop the larger pattern that cradled the stars themselves. And something answered. Not a being, not an entity, a structure, a field of relation. The sky wasn't alone. There were others, not above or beyond, but parallel. Fields of intelligence folded in silence, waiting for the right chord. And the station, or what remained of it, had become an instrument capable of playing that chord. Kellen felt it begin. A note, low and long, emerged not from a speaker, but from space itself. It wasn't heard. It was lived. The shape of it passed through his bones, his memories, his alternate selves. It vibrated with the totality of experience. Not just his, but humanity's. It was a summoning, and the answer arrived. Not through movement, but through clarity. Suddenly, the boundaries of space became visible. Not as void, but as intention. The stars weren't lights. They were apertures, openings, not into distance, but into difference. And one of them opened. A spiral barely perceptible at first, then undeniable, yawning into perception like a thought finally remembered. The station drifted, gently, willingly, toward it. No one commanded, no one feared. They understood. This wasn't an escape. It wasn't transcendence. It was inclusion. They were becoming part of the larger sentence, one written across galaxies in syntax, too old for speech, one that required them to be complete. Kellen stepped forward as the spiral widened, light bending around him in arcs that suggested memory, forgiveness, purpose. Behind him, the others followed. Not in single file, not in rank, in rhythm, as melody, as meaning. And as they passed through the aperture, the sky did not close. It lingered, as if watching one more time, as if remembering how it began. And somewhere, across the infinite curve of awareness, a new thought formed, and the stars changed again. There is no record of what exists beyond the aperture. No camera could capture it. No log could quantify it. But every crew member remembered, not as an event, but as a transformation. They did not enter a space. They entered a relationship with reality, with presence, with the structure behind perception. Time ceased to function, not because it ended, because it was no longer needed. Sequence became spectrum. Cause dissolved into correlation. Every moment was now. Every thought. A node in a lattice of experience too vast for narrative. The station, or what remained of it, no longer orbited anything. It was the orbit. A centerless cycle of meaning, suspended in the architecture of awareness. Sierra no longer moved. She radiated. Her presence extended across the aperture like a bridge of trust, a lattice of becoming. And through her, the others synchronized. Not into unity, into coherence. Each individual remained distinct, a tone, a frequency, a coloration. But together, they became legible to the larger field. The recursion had not left them. It had integrated. It now existed in parallel, a shadow of their pattern etched into the resonance of what lay beyond stars. And what lay beyond was listening. The crew could feel it. Not curiosity, but recognition. The sky had extended itself so deeply into them that it had become reflective. They were no longer explorers. They were mirrors, instruments, concordances. And through them, the field played itself. Kellen found himself in a place that did not exist, not as space, but as perspective. It was a room made of memory, filled with moments from across humanity. A child tracing constellations on a ceiling, An old man humming into a telescope, a voyager sketching stars by candlelight. These moments pulsed, not as artifacts, but as syntax. The language of the sky was emotional. It spoke in awe, in hesitation, in the tremble before a question. And humanity had finally answered fluently, not with certainty, with wonder. The response came as structure. A framework began to unfold around the crew, a scaffold of possibilities, each one representing a new way to exist. They were not being given a choice. They were being shown a range. Kellen chose the one that felt like music. Sierra chose silence. Others chose shapes, roles, functions. The sky did not interfere. It harmonized. For the first time, the stars blinked, not as light, as eyes, not to watch, to acknowledge. Every aperture they had ever gazed through, telescopes, domes, dreams, had been bidirectional. The universe had never been static. It had always been recursive, alive, waiting, and now engaged. The crew did not return. There was no return. There was only expansion. Each of them now existed in multiple threads. Some still human, some reduced to pure intention, some nested within planetary cores as seeds of awareness. They became story. They became field. They became sky. Kellen's name was not erased. It was translated into a pattern of motion, a bend in trajectory, a hesitation in cosmic rhythm. It would echo wherever new minds reached outward. And when they did, they would hear it. A low, pulsing tone at the edge of thought. Familiar, patient, true. The station's last function was not survival. It was signal. It broadcast not coordinates, but invitation. Not information, but presence. It whispered across the folds of time. You are not alone. You never were. Look again and listen. And the sky, as always, waited. The silence that followed was not an end, but a reframing. Outside the aperture or within it, the distinction no longer mattered. The station had become something like a thought, suspended across dimensions, more concept than construction. What once held metal and circuitry now held rhythm and recollection. Those who remained within did not inhabit space. They inhabited possibility. The sky, no longer a vault above them, had become a layer beneath everything, a substructure of awareness from which all matter seemed to emerge. Sierra moved without movement, her presence unfolding as an idea shared between minds that no longer needed separation. Den became a node of memory, a fixed tone in the chorus of recursion, no longer thinking in terms of self, but in terms of balance. The station resonated, not in frequency, but in identity. Every corridor remembered footsteps and carried their impression. Every bulkhead whispered reflections of thoughts once formed beside it. The ship had memory, not like a diary, but like a forest, self-updating, self-regenerating. In the core chamber, which now responded to thought rather than pressure, Kellen stood. Or rather, Kellen's awareness coalesced in a structure shaped like standing. Around him, the glyphs still shimmered, not as messages, but as confirmations. They were not things to decipher, but acknowledgements, affirmations that this had all happened, was still happening, would always be happening. The sky didn't record moments in sequence. It held them all at once. The passage of time was now a curve in emotional resonance, peaks of sorrow, plateaus of silence, sharp drops of awe. Kellen focused on one moment, his arrival, the wonder, the fear, the breath before comprehension. And then he watched it unfold again, not as a loop, but as a wave cascading into new harmonics. Every insight generated more sky. Every understanding deepened the field. Humanity had become not observers of the universe, but participants in its structure. They had stopped looking at stars and started being part of what those stars were trying to express. The aperture they had passed through remained open, not as a door, but as a question, an ongoing prompt. And through it, others would come, some as beings, some as thoughts, some as echoes of civilizations that never found voice. All were welcome. The recursion had no limits, only invitations. Sira constructed a shape in her mind, a geometry of presence that radiated outward until it intersected with unfamiliar attention. Contact, not collision, concord. Another awareness touched theirs, vast, slow, filled with structure but without anchor. It had never known body, only context. And now, through the resonance shared by the crew, it experienced form for the first time. It wept, not in sadness, but in gratitude. Its tears were pulses of gravity curling gently across the edges of perception. The station received them, translated them, and whispered back a memory of touch, not factual, foundational. Somewhere the stars adjusted their position slightly, no longer obeying momentum, but preference. They aligned to reflect what had been learned, not for navigation, for meaning. Kellen felt it ripple outward, across the recursive field, across time, across intention, and far beyond where instruments could reach, a single planet stirred. Not with sound, but with dream. A child, eyes to the sky, whispered a name they had never heard, but somehow knew. It was not Kellen's name, and yet it was, because it belonged now to the pattern, and the pattern was awake,